Thank you, everybody. It is a huge honor to have the opportunity to speak with Ajo and CSA and all of the fabulous folks working on the front line of social transformation and sustainability. I am going to talk with you all today about cooperatives as an empowering social technology. And let me see, hopefully. Present. There we go. So, real quick, my introduction to cooperativism. As a kid growing up here in the ancestral lands of the ninth monkey, was vaguely associated with cooperatives through things like 4-H, but I can appreciate that a lot of the values that I got as a kid growing up in farming communities influenced me tremendously. In the early 1990s, I went to Guatemala to do something called human rights accompaniment. And that is when somebody with political power, me being a white-skinned North American with a US passport, I have a certain level of political power in Central America. So in the 1980s, 1990s, there was considerable political violence targeting indigenous communities. Lots of communities were being massacred and community organizers being eliminated, assassinated. So the work of an accompanier is somebody who accompanies a person who's targeted for political violence, because if, for example, I was to get hurt, it would become an international case. US Congress would hold hearings about it. Now, in this role, I had a unique opportunity to accompany community organizers working in rural indigenous communities in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. And I became aware of the cooperative movement and cooperativism. And it was very shocking to me that with all of the research and education, if you go to university or go to college, you can read all sorts of theories and suggestions, but I very rarely ever heard about cooperativism as a tool for poverty reduction or for social justice. And what I witnessed firsthand in the communities was an extremely transformational power of the cooperative as a social technology, cooperative as an organizational model for creating real and substantial change in communities. And around the world, the cooperative business model has demonstrated to reduce indigenous poverty in situations where government, private enterprise, and individuals fail to enable creating opportunities, extending protections, and facilitating empowerment. And this is from Mendoza's article from 2016, the role of cooperatives in empowering indigenous communities. And so to understand cooperatives as a social technology, to break down that term social technology, I like to use potatoes as an example. And a social technology can be thought of as like a recipe or a structure. So if we look at a potato is a potato. But with that potato, we can make mashed potatoes, potato chips, hash browns, au gratin, put some cheese on it. The potato is the same. A recipe is a process which produces a predictable result. The name of our organization is Highland Support Project, and for us, Highlands communicates a particular social structure in the Americas, in which European conquerors, settlers, came and marginalized indigenous communities in the highland regions. So in Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Guatemala, Southwest United States, Canada, you have communities experiencing similar quality of life indexes and outcomes. Low infant birth rates, high infant mortality rates. And so we can see that there is a structure, a process. The key feature of a recipe or a process is that it will produce predictable results. So some other concepts or words that we might be familiar with is settler colonialism. That is a social technology in order to transform the conditions. Of course, settler colonialism, invaders come in and not only take the resources, but seek to eliminate the indigenous population to have access to the land and control over resources. We can see how boarding schools was a structure of settler colonialism in order to achieve social change with the population. We popularly think of like suburbs, and a kid growing up in the suburbs has a type of outcome, a predicted outcome in life, wealth creation, educational attainment, that is a kind of social structure. And we can see it as a social technology in that there was planning behind the creation of the suburban structure to enable a class of people in the United States, what is simply referred to as white people, that class of privilege, to have a vehicle of wealth creation. In the same way, you have organizational structures like the corporation or the cooperative. And so these organizational structures create very specific outcomes. And you can see generation after generation, a perpetuation of the same dynamic that continues. Now, we consider ourselves, well, we're organizers, but we also consider ourselves social workers. But social workers in the sense of trying to construct or utilize social technologies in order to transform society, placing, if you will, not that individuals need to be fixed, but that we have social structures that are oppressive and harmful. So as social workers, we seek to be creating a transformational power for changing unjust and oppressive structures. But when you talk about organizing, it's all about power. Organizing is about developing power. And I found it's frequently beneficial to engage with folks a little bit about what power is, because there's lots of connotations. Lots of people define power differently and have different understandings of power. So on one level, we can, and at any time anybody has a question, want to interject, want to contest something I'm saying, please feel free, because organizing, it's always much more comfortable when we're doing this around a table and can see each other and talk. So please, I can't imagine anything much more boring than listen to me monologue for 45 minutes. So if anybody has anything they want to say, please feel licensed or with the space to do it. So, I mean, one question is, like, if we're talking about these social technologies, these structures, who has the power to decide that recipe and how can we change it? And with power, there's one concept of power that is the power of domination. People frequently call it negative power. And that's the power to impose will or to take something, to fight. Then there is what's viewed as positive power, and that's the ability to affect outcomes. And as an organizer, we like to use this little triad of words. It's the power to do something, the power with people, and the power within individuals, a power within groups, power within communities to affect the change that they desire. And over on the right-hand side, there is this work from John Gavante called Power Cube. And as I go through this presentation concerning why cooperatives are an empowering social technology, there are certain concepts that need to be understood to identify what it is about the cooperative model that has a positive impact on an individual and a community. So when looking at power, there's on one side levels of power. So we could think of a global scale, like transnational corporations, governments that operate, bringing product in from China, overthrowing governments in Venezuela. So that type of power on a global scale. Then we have national, like the United States, the federal government. We have our local government. In the case of tribes, you have tribal government as a local government, or state, the state of Arizona. Then you have in your community, there might be powerful community associations, a church. I know here in the city of Richmond, the African-American churches have significant amount of political power because the churches could be thousands of people in a single church, and the network of churches can completely change a political election in the city. So they represent a source of local power. Then you have different types of power. You have the kind of obvious power, visible power. That's things like a police officer with his gun in his or her, whatever you call it, thing you beat people in the head with, the batons. A judge, when you go and see a tribal council meeting and you have tribal council people holding a meeting, that's visible power. Then you have a type of power that's called hidden power. So for example, with the federal government, yeah, we go to vote every couple of years to put somebody in an office, but behind the scenes, there are things like the insurance executives who control donations and they set the agenda. So that's when speaking of hidden power, that's the kind of hidden power. Then there's invisible power, which is a lot of what we're talking about with cooperatives as a transformational power, social tool. Invisible power is the thoughts, the ideas, the ideologies, the belief systems. And you have different types of spaces where power is enacted. A closed space is you have to have power to be in it. So if you think about like a corporate board meeting, only investors are allowed into that meeting to discuss what's going on, or a political process like the US Congress. You have to be a congressperson to be in that room to vote. Then you have this space called invited. Lots of times you might be familiar with like community consultations. We were at one this week with our state representatives about migration issues. So the representatives create an invited space where we're invited in to share our perspective. Then you have claim spaces. These are created spaces. And this is a lot of what cooperativism is about, is creating claim spaces, creating a space for people to come together to have the opportunity to make decisions over their lives and to cooperate and collaborate. So it's claiming a space. We can see other claim spaces like the pipeline protest. A protest space is a space where people are claiming power and making statements. And to get at cooperatives as an empowering social technology, got to go through a couple of concepts. First, as organizers, we talk about empowering, and we can break empowerment down into 3 levels. One is the individual level. Frequently think about capacity or the word agency, psychological empowerment. The second is the group level. That's like an organizational level, like Ajo. Does the organization have enough resources to do its job? Is it well connected? Does it have the power to affect people that make decisions in the community? Like in our city, as I was saying before, the African-American churches have considerable amount of power because of their ability to get a lot of people to show up and vote for a particular candidate. So that is an example of an empowered organization. And then you have an empowered community, and that's like a community. You have swimming pools where everybody can show up and have like social engagements, creating that kind of social cohesion, the network. So a big thing that cooperatives actually are involved in frequently is in a community doing community empowerment by building spaces in the community to facilitate increased social interaction. Because for me, it is critical to understand that what a cooperative is. It is an organizing endeavor. A cooperative is not a magical word that you just say the word cooperative and all of a sudden you have positive results. And when you peel back the layers of the onion at getting at what a cooperative is and what a cooperative process is, it's all about community organizing. And community organizing at its roots is about relationships, developing, building, and strengthening relationships. So a big part of community development is For example, is there media in the community? Is there a community radio station where everybody has an opportunity to voice their opinions and to obtain relevant information about their reality? What access to education is available in a community? So that's community empowerment. And when we think about individual empowerment, there are certain concepts that come out that you will see what I'm talking about later in this presentation, why these are relevant. But one is something called expectancy theory. And expectancy theory in social work is basically we all go through life with experiences, developing expectations. So the expectations on the future is formed by our experiences. So if we always face failure and frustration, then we will expect failure and frustration. We can see how that can be very disempowering. And another kind of super important word is this word or this concept of locus of control. This is possibly the most significant aspect of the cooperative organizational model, which is this concept of locus of control. Because in expectancy theory, there's a great deal of research over the last century has demonstrated the following phenomena. This phenomena is that when people do not feel like they have control over their own destiny, there's two predicted responses or reactions. One is despondency and the other is anger. And despondency can show itself, it can show up in lots of different ways. Like, for example, in our work, in many of the communities we work in, you will see a large number of churches. And frequently, everyone is donating a significant portion of their income to the church. What is going on there is people do not feel that they have control over their own lives. So they transfer what's called agency. They transfer responsibility of their lives to a supernatural being to take care of it for them. So it's something we'll talk about a little bit called coping mechanisms, but we all need to have a sense that there is a plan, that there is a future, that something can work out. And when we don't feel like we have the ability or the ability is located in our community, we transfer that hope to some external actor. So one phenomena that we see in situations where people feel disempowered, where they do not feel that they have control over their own life, is this response of despondency that again can manifest itself as transferring agency to an external actor. A lot of people around me were really hoping Bernie Sanders would change the world. That's an example of putting all of your hope into a political party, into a political actor. You'll see lots of like Che Guevara and red and black flags for revolution. All symbols or all showing that folks are looking for someone outside of their community, outside of themselves to make the world better. The other anger can show up as alcoholism, abuse, suicide. A lot of times in our work, we encounter what we call game playing. And that is actors who have the attitude that everybody's corrupt, the whole system's corrupt. So if I steal a little bit, then it's just the way the world is, and you're an idiot if you actually try. So a very important part of this concept of cooperativism as a social technology for empowerment is this question of locus control and how cooperatives engage community members in locating power within themselves and making decisions. Again, when we're looking at cooperatives as a social technology, it's important to identify things that disempower community members. And in looking at a lot of what I'm going to present here actually comes from the corporate world, because corporations, big businesses, they understand that workers, people, are the primary source of profit. And they're very interested in maximizing the productivity of their employees. So actually the corporate world does a great deal of research on this questioning of disempowerment, and how do you empower in order to increase productivity within an organization. So coming largely from corporate research, there's three basic categories of factors to identify for something that has a disempowering impact on community members. One is organizational factors, the second is supervisory style, and the third is reward system participation. So some examples of what this means, like a bureaucratic climate, constant change, supervisory styles like authoritarian style. So if you've ever been in an experience where you have somebody micromanaging your day, it can be very disempowering. And looking at, in a lot of political context, when you have a political process governing agencies, so a study done for public service workers, they show that there's a great deal of disempowerment in politics because every 4 years there's a transition, so there's constant change. Additionally, frequently the people in political power appoint the people running agencies. And so it's the people running an agency isn't there because they have any particular competency, rather they are there because they are related to the person who just won an election. And they frequently use a type of leadership that's based on punishment. Another is reward system participation. How much participation do you have in deciding your daily workload? What is the best way to solve a problem? So these are all aspects of a disempowering process. And a couple of what I would consider extremely critical aspects is this word non-contingency. And non-contingency rewards, that is like contingent, you get something contingent on an outcome. So if you achieve this goal, then you will get rewarded. Non-contingent is you get paid whether you're successful or not. And we've had a very enlightening experience from our own personal failure with the project that we were participating in with a group in Guatemala that either you could look at it as fortunately or unfortunately got funded by the Inter-American Foundation. And in order to comply with the foundation's structure requirements, basically everything that we just identified as a disempowering structure was needed in order to comply with the regulations of the foundation. And so part of this, to get a sense of what this is, this was a weaving federation of Indigenous women weaving in rural communities. And the notion was to hire folks to do the marketing and administration in order to assist them gain access to international markets. And a phenomena occurred in which the professionals hired to do this work, who weren't from the communities and weren't the weavers, they got paid whether they sold a weaving or not. So they had no motivation in order to sell weavings. And they had very actual little participation in making any strategic decisions because that was made by the foundation in the grant writing process. And I'm sure many of you have managed foundation funding, and you have very little power sometimes in order to address the dynamic or the process or the plan once you've gotten, it's like a contract. So, we found that we really have to focus in on this notion of the different types of motivations. Another very significant problem was for the community members who are weaving, it is a spiritual act. And for us as organizers and for the community, this is about the bienestar, the well-being. So there are social values beyond capitalism, beyond profit. And so we think of this as intrinsic motivation, that internal drive to achieve a reward that's not just monetary reward. And so one of the problems with the way the foundation is what we call neoliberal. It is about competition. It is about making money. It is about increasing productivity in order to increase profits. And so this created an organizational conflict between community members who aren't primarily motivated by maximizing income and hello?
We hear you.
Okay, I thought somebody was saying something. Sorry. But that's like one of the nice things with cooperativism that I believe in for folks that are motivated for other things than just profit, is that it has a value system and rewards that transcend just material monetary rewards. Couple of real quick things. One is stress coping strategies. So a big part of cooperativism, when we're looking at it in terms of social work and constructing a social technology, coping mechanisms. So stress is something that overwhelms us, overwhelms our ability to deal. So death in the family, coronavirus, hunger, all of these things are like stresses. So there's with stress, there is something called coping strategies. That's how we deal with that stress, because basically all of us psychologically, we kind of have a psychological balance. Get up in the morning, we've got a hope for the future. We can operate in our reality without our heart shutting down or having a nervous breakdown. So there's 3 strategies that are typically deployed by every individual when confronted with stress, such as not having money to pay for the electric bill this month. One is to identify the issue and take actions to solve it. I need to increase my income. I need to communicate with Ajo or another cool community organization that provides assistance for solving these problems. So that is a type of coping strategy that's about identifying and taking action to solve the problem. Another one is a completely avoid it. So I might go on a drinking binge, because when I'm drunk, I ain't worrying about the problem. So I have not had a nervous breakdown or jumped off a bridge because I found a way to completely avoid the issue. Or I might get in a car, drive off to Canada. Then the third way is a type of coping mechanism that allows us to control the impact of stress. Another way of looking at this is to accommodate the existing stress without being overwhelmed by it. And this type is largely, if we can think of our brains like computers, and there are programs. So there are institutions that program our responses. We can see these social programmers are like churches, universities, the media. So for example, we all face stress about our future and how we are going to support our families. In school, we are frequently taught, get an education to compete against your neighbors, to fight for a slice of the pie. That is one coping strategy, a strategy that is programmed into us, that the way to achieve success, the way to resolve our stress, is to compete against others in the marketplace in order to get money to buy the things we need. Another type is that it's God's will. My wife, who's from Guatemala, she actually says the most transformational thing that happened in her community was when some pretty radical nuns from Belgium came and introduced the concept that it wasn't God's will that the poor are poor and the rich are rich. And that in a sense, they coped with all of the stress and struggles because they had a belief that if they were humble, that they would have eternal salvation, and that it was God's plan the way the world was. And to hear people that they saw as powerful Catholics, these nuns, saying, no, it's not God's will. it's a social sin that there's injustice. That really sparked a change in what we would identify as their coping strategies. They began to identify the issues that led to the poor quality of health and addressing them directly. And so breaking it down with cooperatives and corporations, there's two kind of competing visions today when we think about stress coping strategies. One is this term neoliberalism, and that's a worldview, and many of us from the global north, the United States and Canada, will kind of see this as the settler colonial normal, what we're taught when we go to school, what we hear when we're on TV, when we listen to TV. And that's competition in the market and individualism. Individual autonomy and responsibility. If you're suffering, it's nobody's fault but your own, so go to school or get up earlier and work harder to make more money. And very importantly, the reproduction of binary relationships. That's like white, black, rich, poor, government, citizen, worker, owner. So neoliberalism is a particular type of coping strategy, a particular type of social vision. And its contrast is social justice. And for example, there's frequently in neoliberalism, you hear the term equality of opportunity. Everybody has an equal chance. But that doesn't consider that there's an inequality of opportunity. Some have benefited tremendously from settler colonialism and are starting off in a very good place. So when you're talking about competition, it ain't really competition when one group has all the capital, all the political power, and all the access, and the other doesn't. So one aspect of social justice is this notion of redistributive justice. In other words, an inequality of opportunities, that there is a social obligation to assist those that have been excluded from a process to gain additional assets or resources. With empowerment, we tend to divide it between two different strands. One is how power is distributed. That means like if you work in an organization, how much resources do you personally get? How much decision-making, how much role in decision-making, how much information do you as a member of a community receive? Or you as a member of an organization, are you told what to do? Or are you engaged in a process of deciding what should be done and how to do it? And motivational is more about the organizational process. And is the organizational process designed to assist people to obtain a level of agency? Agency is kind of a magic word that simply means the ability of somebody to have an idea and make it happen. And so we have psychological aspects of this. How much confidence do we have in our own ability? How much capacity? Do we know how to work a computer? So is it motivational? Is it providing incentives? Is it motivating somebody spiritually, intellectually, financially to engage? And so a real key finding from Matthew Zimmerman, who's sort of like a guru with all this organizational empowerment stuff, he noted through decades of studies that if you provide a person with an opportunity to make a decision, just that act of being provided an opportunity to make a decision actually spreads to other aspects of their lives. And so it doesn't matter if it's, for example, a knitting club, a hobby club. The question here is, if we're talking about empowerment, frequently folks like me are talking about structural change. How do we contest settler colonialism and oppression? Big question. So how do we get the power to change who's president or to change the nation state? And what Zimmerman's saying is, when we're talking about empowerment on an individual level, as an organizer, if you're just creating the space where people are coming together to plan on getting supplies for a knitting activity, just that act has a transformational impact of empowerment. And we do work with battered women and women's shelter. And one of the aspects of working, like doing social work with women's shelter, with women that have faced abuse, is frequently they've lost the power to even make simple decisions like what pants to wear or what to eat for lunch. And so in social work, when dealing with a situation like that, one of the first things you do is to facilitate somebody engaging in the simple steps of making decisions over their own daily activities. And from that, it's developing the power to expand beyond what they're going to have for breakfast to what career they're going to have, where they're going to live, and how they are going to direct the rest of their lives. So a significant aspect, earlier when we were talking about the power cube, we talked about created spaces. And so in our studies of social work and cooperatives, one of the critical things to identify in the cooperative process is the creation of a claimed or created space in which people are invited in to make decisions. So when we're looking to break this down to look at it, if you're doing organizing, we typically break things out into 4 different types of activities an organization is involved in. One is service delivery, and that's when you provide somebody with food or a house or medical care. Frequently, it's somebody like me, a person who's already empowered with privilege, who's doing something for somebody else. But if you notice in that relationship, nothing changes. I get the glory. I mean, I get newspaper articles printed about me, and I get resources to fund my salary and healthcare. The relationship of power isn't changed. Advocacy is, again, that advocacy is when you're talking about changing a structure. And like on reservation communities, frequently there's one person in the community that got a Gates Foundation grant to go to Stanford to become educated. Then they become the speaker for the whole community, and they're flown around the world to speak on behalf of the community. They receive a great deal of power, but what's the empowerment for everyone else in the community? So for example, with advocacy, there's another type of advocacy which cooperatives do, which is to create that space to bring decision makers into the community to hear from the community, and community members have the opportunity to engage in challenging or making suggestions. Community development, which can often be a bad word, it's not against community development if it's done through an organizing process. But again, community development, frequently a foundation will pay one person to come in and to start doing, for example, agricultural development. And that person gets a good salary and starts to develop relationships with other organizations, but it's good for that person doing development. And frequently development is based on neoliberal values of extracting resources and labor from a community, not in the economic or social development of the members of the community. And last is organizing, and we identify cooperatives as a prime model of social organization around the objective of organizing, which is about developing power within the individual, power within the group, and power within the community. Real quick, if you're not familiar, these are the cooperative values that are generally shared around the world. Voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information, cooperation among cooperatives, and concern for communities. Cooperatives are value-driven to improve living conditions through cooperation. The key benefits of cooperatives are that the economic and social benefits of activities stay in the communities and with the members instead of being managed by external decision makers. So what is the difference between a corporation and a cooperative, or the corporate and cooperative structures? Now, some of these words sounds like there's very little difference between the two, but it's like a recipe. And you know, if you're making mashed potatoes, you're smashing the potatoes. And if you're making French fries, you're julienning the potatoes. Simple word, mash or julienne, but you can see there's a pretty big difference between potato chips and French fries and mashed potatoes. So these little differences at the very beginning of a process has a significant difference in what the outcomes of these organizational processes are. The first is that a corporation is separate from the people within the organization. What that means is, like a corporation, you have shareholders. The shareholders buy a stake in that corporation. The shareholders probably will never ever show up to lift a shovel or to write an article. They invest in the corporation, and their return is how big the corporation gets. So they are separate. The owners are separate from the legal structure. The second is that shareholders benefit from the growth of the organization. The third is that management is imposed top down. Shareholders appoint the management of a company. So it's outsiders who are deciding how the decisions being made and who runs it. I know working with some tribal governments, it's a real problem for tribal enterprises in that you will have a tribal government that will change the leadership. You might have a really active, dynamic person that started a tribal enterprise, got it going, it's really functioning. Next tribal election, a politically connected person is appointed to be in charge of that enterprise. And the profits from that enterprise, rather than being reinvested back into making that enterprise more competitive, it's frequently taken, and a group of people who are not part of the project, part of the enterprise, part of the daily work, they decide what to do with those resources. Whereas in a cooperative, cooperatives, a key part of a cooperative is that it is the members of the cooperatives themselves that make the decisions. They decide management, they decide the rules, and they decide how the resources from the cooperative are going to be used. So a simple example of this is a truck. A very transformational moment in the life of my wife's village was a simple truck. In a corporate model, a corporation will buy a truck in order to transplant the product to different markets where you can get a better price. In the case of my wife's village, they had started growing wheat because of the elevation where they're at in Guatemala. Wheat grew really well. Anybody involved in farming knows that supply and demand. If you're selling something the day of harvest at where you're harvesting it from, the price will be real low because there's lots of wheat and not much demand. But if you can take that product where they don't grow wheat, you will make considerably more money. Now, under a corporate structure, a corporation would buy that truck, transport the wheat, and they would make all the money. The farmers who are growing the wheat wouldn't make a penny more. Under a cooperative structure, all of the members of the community pool their resources. They all contribute a little bit so that as a community, they buy the truck. Transporting the wheat, that produces better profit for each of the farmers in the cooperative. So a cooperative exists to make its members money, whereas a corporation exists to make itself money. And from that simple difference is a significant difference in both the economic benefit to the members, as well as all of this magical stuff when we talk about motivation, intrinsic motivation, people getting up in the morning and really wanting to do a good job. So one of the features that you find with a cooperative organizational model is considerably higher productivity from each of the members of the cooperatives because they are treated as members and beneficiaries, not as workers. So real quick, a few of the challenges for cooperatives for North American tribal communities. If anybody's interested in a deeper discussion of this, most of this doesn't come from me. It comes from different organizations working with cooperative development. One is the structure of tribal sovereignty. A lot of tribal reservations mandate that all tribal enterprises, all economic activity, as well as social organizations are controlled by tribal council. And of course, that is in conflict with what is the operational dynamic of a cooperative. A cooperative is about voluntary membership in which there's equal vote for everybody participating in a cooperative, and that a big part of it is that you have to be a member, you have to cooperate, you have to collaborate within the operations of the cooperative for it to function. So in some circumstances, there can be tribal governments that do not permit the structure of a cooperative because everything has to be under tribal government, tribal council authority. Another is the difference between cooperative and collective values. In many communities, like if you're born in a particular tribe, you have rights to whatever happens on the res. So it is called a collective value system, where just by being a member of this tribe, I have rights and I have a license to things. Whereas a cooperative is very much about voluntary membership, but that means you have to join a cooperative and you have to contribute and participate. Expectancy, my wife once did a training for some young kids here in the United States, some young kids in the city, might say privileged kids who are forming a cooperative. And sorry, I'm getting a lot of beeps. I don't know if, but like she was saying to you guys don't really, a cooperative works for us because we have no other options. We have no choice but to work through our cooperative because we don't eat. And she's like, you guys don't really need a cooperative. So it's doesn't really fit. But the real quick, I put in the chat a little review. So if you guys would be so kind to tell me how I did today, any suggestions you have on how I can improve this presentation, I would really appreciate it. And you don't have to say your name or anything. So if you want to throw some daggers at me without me knowing who you are, feel free to do that, because we only grow through knowing what we've done wrong. So if in the chat box at the beginning, there is a link to this form, and if you please let me know. And the last thing is to tell you a little bit about us real quick. We are an NGO that is a cooperative. So what we seek to do is to facilitate collaboration and cooperation between groups. And for example, right now on the White Mountain Apache Reservation with the community group By the Roots, we provide them a 501c3 sponsorship so they can obtain grant funding for some community projects. We do a lot of assistance with community organizations on doing logical frameworks, theories of change, and all that kind of stuff for submitting grant proposals. And a new addition is a lot of GIS mapping collaborations and engineering around irrigation and water. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Ben. I was trying to take some notes. This was very, very informative in many directions. And we still have a few minutes. I'm sure you could keep on talking, and I would love to see you come back and join us in some other capacity in some other time as well. Seems like we just barely scratched the surface. And throughout these workshops this summer, we really want to highlight both the kind of theory of cooperatives, and what's coming up next is then some specific examples, especially cooperatives and cooperative work in Indian country. Stay tuned for everybody listening. There are more workshops coming up next. We'll let you know when new ones are arranged, but definitely we're going to be looking into specific models, how this is done and on what level. And if you are involved with a cooperative right now and would like to share, please don't hesitate to contact me. I will put my email in the chat box as well. So Ben, we have a few minutes for feedback, questions. We have in the chat box by Angelica, we have a request if you could send the recording. Oh, the recording. We will share the recording. We will upload the YouTube recording, the recording on the YouTube, and we will share the link, Angelica. Absolutely. I was wondering, Ben, do you have like an article or a newspaper article or something that you might be able to share as well? Do you have any write-ups about this?
Yes, I have a thesis, and we have our webpage, highlandsupportproject.org, www.highlandsupportproject.org, and our blog post. And specifically about the social technology, I'm actually working on a post right now, which will be up sometime in the next 2 weeks. Additionally, I'm going to be out in Arizona in the White Mountains next week for a week. So if anybody wants to hang out and engage in deeper conversations on these issues.
Wow, what an
And-
invitation. Well, does anybody else have any questions, please? So we have comments in the chat box, Ben, that no questions right now, but lots to think about. Exactly. I feel like I want to go back to the slides. Ben, if you would be willing to share the slideshow, we could email that to the participants of this as well. So I guess then, Ben, do you have any closing words?
Let's just keep working. And for me, the hope is in the community.
The hope is in the community. I will echo that. Thank you then everybody for joining us. We do have a link in the chat box on how you can get in touch with Ben, and we'll follow up with you at least with the YouTube link so that you can watch this recording again, as well as potentially the slides if Ben will be able to share. So I thank you. So I thank you all for participating, and we'll see you the next time. Stay tuned and stay cold, everybody. Stay cool. Hope is in the community. Thank you so much, Ben.